There's a particular kind of invisibility that gets assigned to women in uniforms who carry bandages instead of rifles. Not the invisibility of being overlooked, though that too. Something more deliberate than that. A categorization. A filing away. Basically, she's the soft part. She's the safe part. She's, to be fair, the part that doesn't count when the counting gets serious. I have watched this happen in 14 countries across 9 years of field documentation. I have watched men with rank and weapons look straight through a woman crouched over a bleeding body and see essentially furniture. Useful furniture. Furniture that speaks softly and keeps the machines running long enough for the real work to happen. I was in that forward operating base in the Panjshir Valley when the insurgents came through the eastern perimeter. Sort of eyed my notebook, on my camera. I'd exactly none of the training that was about to become relevant. She had a name, Warrant Officer Nasreen Moradi, 31 years old, medic, 8 years in, 2 deployments before this one. She had a habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she was thinking hard. She had a photograph of her niece taped inside her kit case. She also had something nobody in that room had thought to calculate. I am writing this because what happened in the next 4 hours did not fit inside any category I prepared. Not the categories of courage, because courage implies a choice made from a position of relative safety. Not the categories of heroism, because heroism has a finish line, a moment where the music swells and the math resolves. What Nasreen did had no finish line. It just kept going, and going, until the men who had walked in thinking she was furniture had to revise everything they thought they understood about what a room contains. Every FOB, to be fair, has its specific smell. This one was diesel and instant coffee and the particular sweetness of a medical kit that's been opened and repacked so many times the gauze has absorbed everything around it. Antiseptic and altitude and something underneath both of those that I never found a word for. The smell of a place that was built to be temporary, but had stopped believing that about itself. I'd been embedded with the unit for 11 days. My assignment was straightforward, at least on paper: document the humanitarian coordination effort between the NATO advisory team and the local medical infrastructure. Write the human story. Find the human angle. My editor back in Berlin had used the phrase boots on the ground perspective 4 times in our last call, which told me, look, he had never been anywhere that required boots on anything. I actually was not a soldier. I want to be precise about that, because what follows could be misread as the story of someone who became one. I had a press credential, a satellite phone, and a complete inability to assemble a rifle in under 4 minutes. A skill I'd watched the 18-year-olds around me perform the way I might shuffle a deck of cards. Casual, which barely conscious. Muscle memory built from somewhere in T-bin. My personal contribution to any crisis in this building would be stay low, stay out of the way, and write it down accurately after. That was the deal. Nasreen Moradi did not know I was watching her the afternoon before everything changed. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care, which would be more consistent with what I came to understand about her. She was working in the triage staging area, a room that had been a storage space for vehicle parts before someone bolted a cot to the floor. Called it medicine, running inventory on her medical kit with the door open and the noise of the base filtering in around her. She counted instruments the way other people count money, with her whole attention, moving each item from one side of the case to the other, and back again, lips slightly moving, the inside of her left cheek pulled in between her teeth. Sergeant Don Voss appeared in the doorway. He was Dutch, 26, the kind of broad-shouldered that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He had an air of easy command that I suspected he'd been born with, the way some people are born left-handed. Moradi, Intel briefing in 20. She didn't look up. I'll read the notes after. It's mandatory. My kit inventory is mandatory. The chi came back out. She, I think, moved a suture kit from left to right. If someone bleeds tonight, and I'm short one thing, because I sat in a room listening to people argue about map. Coordinates, that's on me, not on the briefing. Voss stood there for a moment with the posture of a man recalibrating. You're always doing that, he said. Counting things, arguing. She looked up then, and I caught her expression from my angle against the wall. Something between amusement and the very specific exhaustion of having explained yourself too many times to too many people to feel anything sharper about it anymore. I'm completing a task, which you interrupted it. Those are different things. Voss left. She went back to counting. I wrote, "Look," in my notebook. She treats her own argument as self-evident. Doesn't dress it up, which no apology architecture. I've been raised by a mother who apologized before asking for the salt. So this struck me as almost extraterrestrial. The briefing happened without her. I attended it. The intelligence officer, a compact American named Harlan who used the word kinetic as a synonym for violent in a way that made me need to sit on my hands, ran through updated threat assessments for the Valley region. Insurgent movement had been tracked through 3 checkpoints in the last 72 hours. Estimated group size, 8 to 15. Armed. The eastern perimeter of the base had been assessed as the most vulnerable point of entry if they were inclined to test it. Assess probability of incursion, someone asked. Low TBH to moderate, Harlan said. I wrote that down. Low to moderate. I have since had occasion to reflect on the precision of that phrase. The briefing took 40 minutes. Afterwards, in the hallway, I passed Major Erickson, the base commander, Norwegian, 50-something, the kind of man whose fatigue sits in his eyes rather than his posture. He was saying, basically, something to Voss about reinforcing the Eastern Post rotation. Standard procedure. In my opinion, due diligence. Neither of them glanced at the door of the triage room as they passed it. Nasreen was still counting. I found out gradually, across those 11 days, that she had deployed first at 23 to a forward position in Kunduz, that she lost a patient in her first month, a private, 19 years old, a wound. That was survivable if the helicopter had come 20 minutes earlier, and it hadn't. That she'd honestly written the letter to his mother herself because she said the standard form letter read like a tax document, and nobody's kid deserved a tax document. She told me this during one of our evening conversations. She'd agreed, with some skepticism, to occasional informal interviews for my documentation, though she was sort of prone to turning the questions back on me in ways that made me feel I was the one being documented. She told me about the letter with no particular emphasis. Just fact, she'd done it. It had mattered. She still thought about the boy sometimes. The way she said it was not the way people say things when they want you to think well of them. It was the way people say things that are simply true. Does it get heavier? I asked, carrying that. She considered this with the same focus she brought to the inventory. No, she said, but you get stronger. Those aren't the same thing, though. Don't confuse them. I wrote that down and underlined it twice. 3 hours before the breach, there was an incident that I have since come to think of as the first moment. The one that, in retrospect, lit everything that came after. A local interpreter, named Farid, 28, a geology student before the university closed, now essential to every conversation that crossed a language line, came to Nasreen in the late afternoon with a cut on his forearm. Minor, which he'd actually caught it on a wire-running cable through the Eastern Communications Post. She cleaned basically it, butterfly closed it, wrapped it. Standard procedure. For what it's worth, 2 minutes. But Farid sat down on the cot and didn't get up immediately, and Nasreen looked at him with the cheek assessment expression, calculating, and said in Dari that I only caught half of before she slipped back to English. What else? It wasn't a question. Farid said something about his brother. His brother was in a village 11 kilometers east. He'd had no contact in 4 days, which was not the norm. He was, and here he used a word I didn't catch, something between afraid and certain that something had changed in those 11 kilometers. Nasreen listened. She didn't take notes, and she didn't nod the way people nod when they're waiting for their turn to speak. She listened the way a room listens, completely, without an agenda. When he was done, she said, "Tell Erickson. He'll say it's not within scope. Then tell Harlan. Then Voss. Tell everyone until someone listens. And if none of them do, a pause. Not long. Like 2 seconds, maybe 3. Plus, then we deal with what comes." I did not understand what she meant by that in the moment. I filed it. I moved on. I wrote she carries more information than the room gives her credit for, and I was still underestimating her. Dinner in the FOB was a communal, chaotic thing. 2 folding tables, ration packs, the Danish corporal who always somehow produced a working speaker and played music that half the room hated and the other half pretended to hate, but secretly organized their eating around. That evening, it was American rock from the 1990s, a decade I associated with my parents' arguments, and the smell of carpet cleaner. Nasreen ate across from me. She ate fast, the way people eat when they know the break is borrowed time. She had a way of keeping her back to the wall that I'd initially read as antisocial and later understood as tactical. Voslike sat 2 seats down, talking to the corporal about something involving a football match. Major Erickson stood kind of near the door with a coffee, doing the things senior officers do where they're technically present but atmospherically elsewhere. You know what they're not thinking about, Nasreen said. She wasn't looking at me, looking at the room. What's that? Farr had talked to 3 people today. 3, about his brother. She pressed her fork flat against her tray. Nobody pulled that thread. You think they should have? I think when the person who spends the most time near the Eastern Communications Post tells you something feels wrong in the East, you should treat that as signal, not noise. The 4 came back up. But I am, as I'm regularly reminded, not an intelligence officer. She said this with a flatness that contained, compressed, something much older and much heavier than the current annoyance. How often does that happen? I said. The reminding. She looked at me then. Really looked in that way that made me feel briefly x-rayed. You have sisters? She asked. A brother. Ask your sister friends, she said. They'll have a number for you. And then the music changed to something slower, and Voss said something that made the corporal laugh loudly. The room breathed its temporary safety breath, and I wrote in my notebook, and thought nothing about the eastern perimeter for exactly 2 more hours and 40 minutes. It happened fast. That's the thing no briefing language captures, which low to moderate probability does not communicate the speed of the thing itself. The way one moment the base was its nighttime self, a little quieter, the watches changed, the music off, and the next moment the radio on Erickson's belt was producing a sound that snapped everyone in the room from one state of being into another. I was in the document room, a grandiose name for a plywood closet with a folding table, organizing my notes from the day's interviews when the first report came through the wall. Not words, just radio tone, and then running, which is a sound you learn to categorize very quickly in places like this. I came out into the corridor and immediately walked into Voss, who grabbed my arm with a grip that had no gentleness in it and said, "Press room, stay," and then was gone. Plus, I did not go to the press room. I know this was not the right choice. I like to say it was courage that kept me in that corridor, but it was closer to the paralysis of not yet understanding the geometry of what was happening. I pressed myself to the wall outside the medical staging area, and I watched. The breach was 3 points simultaneously, east as far as it had known, and 2 auxiliary points that the briefing had rated lower risk. 11 insurgents confirmed later, though in the noise of those first minutes the counting was not a thing anyone was doing. 8 men with weapons entered the eastern access corridor. Nasreen was already moving. To be fair, not towards safety. That's the thing I keep coming back to in the months since, when I'm sitting somewhere quiet and thinking about what I saw. She was already moving in the direction of the problem before the problem had fully declared itself. As if she'd been expecting it. As if Farid's thread, unpulled by everyone else, had been sitting in her hands all evening, and she'd simply been waiting to see which way it would run. She had her kit. She had. And this is the detail that still undoes me when I think about it. A radio she wasn't supposed to have. A secondary unit she'd talked off a departing logistics sergeant 6 weeks earlier, kept charged, kept on her person. I think not issued to her. Not official. Just hers, because she had calculated that there would come a moment when the official channels would be insufficient and she would need to talk to multiple points at once. That moment was now. She hit 3 channels in 15 seconds. The Eastern Post, the medical tent outside the wire, the interpreter's quarters where Farid was lodged. Separate pieces of information going to 3 separate people before most of the base had fully processed that the information was necessary. And then, this is the part that I couldn't have written if it hadn't been pressed against. That wall watching it happen, because it would have read as invention, as a storyteller's edition. She went back into the triage room. Not to shelter, not to wait, to prep, because she had known, I think, since Farid sat down with his wrapped arm, his unspoken fear honestly, that there would be people bleeding before this was over, and she intended to be ready for them before they arrived. I have thought a lot since about what it costs to be the person who sees things coming and is not believed. Not the dramatic cost, not the cinematic version of being Cassandra, and the daily cost. The small accumulated weight of having your assessments filed under not within scope, your recommendations treated as overreach, your presence in the briefing room as optional. The, in my opinion, cost of being functionally furniture. I think it does one of 2 things to a person. It makes them smaller, quieter. It teaches them to route their knowing through other people, to find the man in the room who will be listened to. Whisper in his ear and let him say it, and call that good enough. Or it builds something in them that's harder and stranger and more difficult to name. Not anger, though anger is part of it. Not pride. Plus, something closer to a private certainty, a self-sustaining system, and a person who has learned through long repetition that the confirmation she needs is not coming from outside and has therefore stopped requiring it. Nasreen Moradi pressed against a metal supply shelf, loading syringes with the lights at half because full light was a targeting error, was that second thing. She had stopped requiring it a long time ago. She was operating entirely on her own authority. And 3 cots were prepped, draped, lit, and waiting before the first wounded man came through the door. He was honestly one of ours. Plus, Corporal Tavi Makinen, finished 22, a hole in his left shoulder that was producing a sound I'd never heard a body make before and will not attempt to describe here because some sounds belong to the room where they happened and not to the page. He came through the door, held up by 2 soldiers who looked at the prepped room with an expression I can only characterize as, oh, thank God she knew. Nasreen did not look up from the kit. Put him on the first cot. Tell me how long he's been down. For minutes. What hit him? The answer came in fragments, overlapping, 2 people speaking at once. She sorted, I think, it the way she sorted inventory, efficiently, completely, without visible effort. She worked for 22 minutes on Tavi Makinen without stopping, without looking up except to instruct, without as far as I could see from the doorway. And I was in the doorway by now. I'd moved there because there was nowhere else to be, making a single unnecessary movement. She had become, in those 22 minutes, the most precise object in the room. And I think outside, the sound of the engagement continued. Radio bursts. Boots on concrete. The percussive vocabulary of violence that I'd spent 9 years learning to be near without understanding. 2, more came in before the first was stable. She had known there would be 3, and I don't know exactly when it shifted, when the men in that room stopped seeing furniture and started seeing what was actually there. It is, well, not a thing that announces itself. People don't stop in the middle of a crisis and reclassify. It happens in the peripheral vision, plus in the small recalibrations, in the way someone says a name, Moradi, with a different weight than they had said it 2 hours before. But I noticed it, and I was, after all, there to notice things, and I wrote it down, 2,214 hours. Voss looks at her the way people look at things they're revising their estimate of. He doesn't have language for it yet. Neither do I. But the revision is happening. The furniture has a name, and the room is learning it. I have, I guess, been in the aftermath of enough things to know this. The moment when the noise stops and the silence rushes in to fill the shape of it, too loud in its own way, pressing against the ears from the wrong direction. The base, I guess, had that silence at 2,219 hours when the last radio confirmation came through. Eastern breach contained, perimeter resecured, 2 insurgents apprehended, 6 dispersed, 3 of ours down, and stabilized. Stabilized. That word arrived like it meant something simple. In the triage room, Nasri Moradi had her hands still inside Tavi Makinen's shoulder. I want to be accurate about the timeline. She had been working continuously for 47 minutes by the time the all-clear filtered through the base. 3 patients, I think, one after the other, overlapping in the 2 worst minutes when the second and third came in simultaneously, and she'd done something I know category for a kind of 3-dimensional assessment that moved her attention through the room in a pattern that seemed to prioritize based on some internal calculation I couldn't follow, but that turned out in every instance to be correct. The second man, Farouk, a local auxiliary soldier, mid-30s, family in Kabul, had a fragmentation injury across his right side that she'd packed and held with one hand while directing the soldier, supporting him with verbal instruction, so precise it functioned like a second set of trained hands. The third was Corporal Yael Brenner, 26, who had taken a strike to her left leg that wasn't life-threatening, but was trying to argue otherwise. Brenner was the loudest of the 3 in the first minutes, screaming, which is the body's reasonable response to a certain kind of pain, and Nasreen had said to her once with a calm that had some iron in it, "Your lung function is perfect. Save the energy." And Brenner had gone to a controlled breathing pattern so quickly that it was obvious she'd recognized, in that calm, something authoritative enough to trust. That is, in my opinion, skill that can't be taught in a classroom. The ability to be the stillest thing in a room that's coming apart. The ability to make your certainty contagious, which Nasreen had built it out of 11 years of being unconfirmed by external sources. I wrote that down later, and in the moment I was just watching, pressed against the doorframe with my notebook against my chest, and my pen moving in a way I was barely tracking consciously. Major Erickson came to the doorway at 22:31. He stood there for a moment before he spoke, a longer moment than I think he intended. He was looking at the room. The 3 cots, the 3 patients in varying states of stabilized, the supply surfaces covered in the organized aftermath of serious medical work. The lone woman at the first cot with her back to the door, still working, unhurried, thorough. "Moradi." 5 minutes, she said without turning. He waited. He did not press it. That, too, was a revision happening in real time. When she turned, finally, she had the expression of someone who has finished a large and difficult task and hasn't yet decided what comes after. Not triumph. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the controlled exhale of a person returning from a place only they had been. Erickson said, "You prepped before they came in?" Not question. "Yes." "You knew." Farid knew. I listened to Farid. A pause. Plus, the kind of pause that contains a lot of history compressed into a few seconds. All the briefings she hadn't been called to, all the intelligence threads she'd picked up and been told weren't in her lane, all the furniture assessment, all of it sitting in that silence between Farid knew and whatever Erickson was going to say next. He said, "I should have listened to Farid." She looked at him for a long moment. The cheek came in, the internal calculation face. Then, yes, you should have. No grace given, which no, it's okay, sir. You couldn't have known. No softening of the accounting, just the ledger read aloud, once, and then closed. Erickson took that. He took it the way a person take a thing they know is accurate. He nodded once and said, "How are they?" And she moved back into the clinical register. Smooth, easy, the register that was neither warm nor cold, but entirely competent, and told him, "Tavi, prognosis good, needs specialist follow-up within 48 hours. Farouk, stable, blood volume concern requiring monitoring. Brenner, pain management required, no structural compromise to the bone. She'd walk without complications." She had done all 3, with 1 kit, and in 47 minutes. Voss found me in the corridor after, which I'd been expecting. He had the look of a man who wanted to debrief something that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, which is a look I have considerable experience receiving. "You were, I guess, watching," he said. "It's my job." He leaned against the opposite wall. His hands were in his pockets, which for Voss was a posture of uncertainty. He was a person who ordinarily occupied physical space with great confidence, and Uncertainty expressed itself in his body as a kind of contraction. She had the room ready, he said. Yes. Before anyone called it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not processing exactly, more like a man watching the shape of something he'd been too close to see from the inside. The way you have to step back from a painting to understand its scale. She tried to tell us, he said. It was not quite a question. Farah tried to tell you. She flagged it. You went to the briefing. He didn't argue that. He had, the decency not to argue it. I thought. He stopped. Started again. There's a thing that happens. You, stop hearing someone because you've already sorted them. Kind of, You put them in the pile mark support role, and you stop running their assessments through the same filter as the people in the other pile. Yeah. He looked at the floor. Yeah. I wrote. Later. He found the language for it faster than I expected. Whether he can, I guess. Hold on to it's a different question. The night did not end with the silence. That would have been too clean. At 0043, Farouk's blood pressure dropped. I was in the document room. I'd finally, 2 hours after the fact, obeyed the original instruction. Gone to the designated safe space, where I'd proceeded to write 7 pages of notes while the base slowly restructured itself around the fact of what had happened. I heard, it through the wall. Not the alarm, but Nasreen's voice, carrying one specific instruction to the auxiliary soldier she'd stationed near Farouk's cot against exactly this possibility. She had left someone watching. She had anticipated the drop. She was back at the cot within 40 seconds. I know this because I timed it sitting in the document room with my notebook, listening through plywood. I wrote 40 seconds and then sat with the number for a while, thinking about what it means to have built anticipation into your preparation so deeply that your response to an emergency begins before the emergency announces itself. She worked for another 30 minutes. I did not see this part. I stayed in the document room because I'd finally understood that my presence in that corridor was not observation. It was at minimum a navigation obstacle and at maximum a distraction, and neither of those was something I was willing to be. But I heard it. I heard her voice, steady, and the other voices around it moving in the pattern of people being directed by someone who knows exactly where everyone should be.